Lifeline is an idea for a game that came way ahead of its time, both in terms of social acceptance and functionality. These days we're so used to talking to digital assistants on our phones and in our homes that it's become second nature. But when Lifeline came out in 2003, we were barely starting to accept that voice chat was going to be a part of online play instead of just text chat. So the idea of a game played almost entirely through voice was still a rather unusual one. We shouldn't pretend it was entirely unprecedented, though. We may have been years away from the wave of voice-controlled games for the Kinect, allowing you to Fusro-da your way through the mountains of Skyrim, but Lifeline was preceded by a few prominent titles in the previous console generation that used a microphone as their primary input device. Hey You Pikachu and Seaman. One of these is admittedly far more weird and horrifying than the other, but they both came out about 6 months apart and both essentially act as virtual pets. You're interacting with either Pikachu or Seaman using the microphone and sometimes telling them to do things directly, especially in Pikachu's case, but it's never anything particularly complex. Lifeline, on the other hand, sold itself as being the next big advancement in voice-controlled video games by offering more complex interactions and many more of them. Lifeline does in fact hail from a genre that historically could be quite frustrating to play, one that the developers over at Sony Computer Entertainment may have thought they could improve by using voice commands instead of controllers. Survival horror. Up to this point, the genre had almost entirely been games like Silent Hill, Alone in the Dark, and Resident Evil. Lifeline certainly takes the vast majority of its cues from the Capcom survival horror games that had preceded it, in the sort of Resident Evil and Dino Crisis vein. There's this grand mystery around the space station you're on, much like the mansion from the first Resident Evil. Why are there all these monsters all over this place? What are the motives of the people who seem to be ultimately behind what's going on here? Add to that lots of endless hallways, loading screen doors, and puzzles that mostly revolve around finding and placing obscure objects, and you've got a game that has liberally borrowed almost all the staples of the genre from the Capcom games that had preceded it. But Lifeline attempts to liven up that formula, which had admittedly grown pretty stale by this point. The game has you commanding a character, Rio, a waitress on board a space station, by voice commands instead of directly controlling her. And you don't just tell her what to do in a general sense. Rio is basically incapable of doing anything without you telling her exactly what to do. Like she's some sort of robot, completely incapable of the most basic deductive reasoning. All the way from picking an item up to shooting an enemy in its giant glowing red spot. Ultimately, I think that's where this game really goes wrong. The desire to have you controlling literally everything with your voice. To be sure, there are definitely major problems with voice recognition itself, especially in high-stakes enemy encounters. I had some truly awful experiences yelling the name of body parts at the screen while Rio just stood there taunting the enemy over and over and wasting healing items and trapping herself in corners and just generally being completely useless before eventually and inevitably dying. But there are parts of the game that actually work well. The consultation segments where you talk to Rio about recent events that have taken place in the story actually generally work pretty well, in part because the game tells you exactly what you need to say. But as soon as you're done having that conversation with her, you're kicked back out into a world where you have to try and figure out exactly what an object on a table is called in order to tell Rio to look at it. Or more realistically, just play the entire game with a walkthrough open, which is what I ended up having to do to avoid being utterly frustrated trying to figure out exactly what I needed to call a piece of paper on a table that I wanted Rio to look at. It was folded up. I thought maybe it was a brochure, but then it turned out I specifically had to call it an invitation, which I had no way to know it was. What's interesting to me, though, is that with a few minor tweaks, adding the ability to ask Rio what she sees in a given area, stripping out the combat entirely, and making this a purely exploration-based game where Rio just kind of wanders around the space station and you talk to her while you both uncover the mystery together. You maybe add a few gameplay elements for you to do in the station control room where you're holed up and talking to her. That would honestly be a potentially great game, one that would have played to the strengths of voice recognition at the time and allowed you to interact with Rio on a level more akin to a game like Seaman or Hey You Pikachu. Granted, the game's narrative has a bevy of its own problems, from incredibly stiff interactions between characters to a thoroughly wild and unsatisfying conclusion to the core mystery, but overall, I actually think in a modern context, this could potentially work really well in a narrative-heavy horror game, or maybe a detective game. There's certainly something to be said for asking a character a question out loud in your own voice, even if you're prompted what to say instead of just choosing it from a menu of options. Of course, we know now that there was another survival horror game in development at the time that was also taking a serious look at how to take the genre in a new direction, how to make it more interesting, how to evolve it. And ultimately, that game did a much better job with a very different approach just a few years later when Resident Evil 4 came out in 2005, transforming the genre into something significantly more action-heavy, at least until the arrival of the first-person horror game much, much later on. I think there's definitely potential in voice commands and games, and I think it's something that could be explored significantly more now, especially on phones. But I also honestly think the technology probably still isn't good enough to be the absolutely perfect experience you might want to have. If you are interested in playing Lifeline, which I do think has some really interesting ideas crammed into its mostly frustrating wrapper, I highly recommend playing it in the Pcsx2 emulator. I looked into playing this on an actual PS2, but was unable to find reliable information on things like exactly what headsets or microphones were compatible with the game, whereas Pcsx2 has a plugin that allows you to simply just use any existing audio input device that you have on your computer to emulate the PS2 microphone. That seemed to work quite well, at least to the level of recognition I'd come to expect from this game.